I'm a PhD student at the Cambridge University Faculty for Divinity, and this very exciting interview will form part of, in fact, it's the first interview of a series of conversations with writers and academics on the theme of illness and spirituality. I'm very, very excited to introduce our first guest to this series, Dr. Gabor Mate, who really needs no introduction. He's a renowned writer, physician, and speaker. And his latest book, which I've got here, The Myth of Normal, has sold over 1 million copies, incredibly. And Dr. Gabor has been speaking for years on the topics of trauma, chronic health issues, addiction, and its relation to the modern world. I'm very excited for this interview for a number of reasons, for a number of personal reasons. Firstly, as a student of religious studies, and my research looks at the lived experience of religion, I'm very excited at a new and emerging intersection between Western psychology or therapeutic models in the West, trauma and illness, and spirituality. And Dr. Gabor often uses or draws from spiritual traditions and metaphors. So that's something very exciting for me, and I'm really excited to see how this conversation unfolds. But secondly, I'm personally excited because I myself am a person suffering from chronic health issues. I'm a disabled student, and I've found some level of healing actually through some of the methods that Dr. Gabor has spoken about, and some insight in my own journey religiously and spiritually. And if there's some relevance to it, we might talk about that today. But with that being said, I'm very, very excited to welcome Dr. Gabor. Thank you so much for joining this series of videos. The first kind of thing I'd love to talk about and just get a bit of foundation on is your latest book, The Myth of Normal. It's done very, very well. So congratulations.
Thank you.
We've benefited from it a lot. Could you outline for us what you mean by this phrase, the myth of normal, or the main thrust of the argument of this book?
Sure. So we usually assume that what is normal is healthy and natural, which in many cases is true. For example, human beings can function within a certain normal range of blood pressure. If it's too low or too high, we might die. Certain range of blood temperature, body temperature, we can thrive. Blood acidity, if it goes beyond or underneath the natural homeostatic limits, we get sick. So what is normal is rightly associated with what is healthy and natural. But then we make a mistake. We take the word normal and we apply it to anything that we get used to. And I'm saying that in this culture, many things that are considered to be normal are neither healthy or natural for human beings. So that there's a myth of normal, and we don't question what we're used to, and yet many of the things that we're used to actually hurt our health. That's the one meaning of it. The other meaning of it is that there's a kind of assumption that there's normal people, then there's abnormal people. And what I'm saying is that really what we consider to be pathology is a whole spectrum of experience, and that most people can find themselves on the spectrum somewhere. So let's not be too supercilious towards people that we consider abnormal. They just have maybe more stress or trauma in their lives, but many of the dynamics that they carry, all of us also harbor. So let's not split the world into the normal and the abnormal.
There's another phrase you have in the title as well, which is toxic culture.
Yeah.
This word toxic is used everywhere nowadays. Toxic relationships, toxic workspaces, and so on. Could you just give us a bit more on? I mean, you mentioned what we live in is we take it as normal, but it's not been normal for humans.
Yeah.
So what is it about our culture that's toxic?
Sure. So again, the analogy that I begin with is a laboratory where a scientist is growing microorganisms in a petri dish. That's called a culture. It's called a laboratory culture. These microorganisms are put into a brew. If the brew is healthy, they thrive, um, they reproduce, they do well. If the microorganisms in this laboratory culture were dying off in large numbers or getting sick or not reproducing well, we would call that a toxic culture. We say, well, what's in this environment that's making these organisms ill? Now, if we look at Western culture from a perspective of the physical and mental health of the population, what we actually find is that amidst the greatest wealth ever accumulated by any societies, the greatest technological advances, the most amazing medical accomplishments, more and more people are getting sick. More and more kids are getting diagnosed with all manner of mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, attention deficit problems, suicidality. More and more kids are being medicated. More adults are developing anxiety in the universities. More people are anxious, depressed than ever before. More people are being diagnosed with autoimmune diseases and so on. And so there's an epidemic of diabetes, of obesity, and so on. So if we look at the culture from the perspective of the health of the organisms that inhabit it, which say the human beings, it's that something in the culture is toxic. Now, what is toxic about the culture
That's the question.
is that human beings have certain needs. And human beings are very adaptable. We're amongst the most adaptable of animals. We can survive in a lot of environments, but that doesn't mean that we achieve our best or our greatest potential or that we thrive. And there's many features of Western globalized capitalist culture that for all the wonderful technological economic achievements and so on, are actually toxic to human beings and the values that we live by. I'll give you two small examples, well, two salient examples. One is from the evolutionary perspective, children were raised very differently. Evolution dictated that human children have certain needs for emotional connection, for physical connection, with the adults, with the whole community of adults. That's gone. Parents are struggling in isolation, under stress. They don't see their kids the whole day. Parents are given all kinds of advice about ignoring their children's signals of distress. Let the baby cry, don't pick them up. That's toxic to the child's brain, toxic to the child's personality development. We're also told, according to the capitalist ethics, that human beings are by nature selfish, aggressive, acquisitive, and competitive. That's completely contrary to how we evolved. We evolved in communities, in collaboration. Wealth and respect didn't go to people who acquired more, but to people who gave more. It's a completely different way how we evolved. Now, ever since we become so-called civilized, we become more and more selfish and more competitive and greater inequalities. But that doesn't reflect our true nature. And so societies, the greater the inequality, for example, the more illness there is. So that what I'm saying is that the values of this culture, for all its achievements, run contrary to basic human needs, both for children and for adults. And that's what's toxic.
And I guess there's another big theme in the book, and it's made very well at the beginning of the book, is that this culture appears to bring about more trauma.
Yeah.
And you use a very kind of specific definition of trauma.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to just elaborate. What do you mean when you use the word trauma?
Well, I just like to stick to the meaning of words, and the word trauma literally is from the Greek, meaning for wound or wounding. So trauma is a wound. So trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. So this is not the trauma. This is the traumatic event. The concussion is the trauma. That's the ongoing wound that hasn't healed. So trauma is an unhealed wound, psychically. And people can be wounded in many, many ways, broadly speaking, by things that are done to them that shouldn't be done, like children being beaten, or violence in the family, or parent being addicted or mentally ill, or parent being jailed, physical, sexual, emotional abuse. People can be wounded that way, but kids can also be wounded not just by bad things being done to them, but by the needs not being met. So a lot of children in our society are wounded in loving families with the parents who are harbor the best of goodwill, but because of the stress that they live under, because of social conditions, and because of the really retrograde advice that they get as to how to parent, children's needs are chronically ignored and even trampled on, and that can wound kids as well.
So, what is the link between trauma and illness?
Okay, so there are two things spring to mind right away. I'll see if there's anything else. One is severe trauma literally affects the body. So children who are traumatized, as adults, they have more inflammation in their bodies. You can measure that by measuring certain inflammatory particles in the bloodstream. So, for example, people who are abused as kids, they're more likely to have inflammatory diseases because there's more inflammation in their bodies. Trauma affects how genes function. The genes don't act autonomously. Genes are turned on and off, or activated or inactivated by what happens in the environment. Trauma can trigger cancer-causing genes. It can turn off cancer-protective genes because it creates long-term stress. Trauma can change the activity and health of chromosomes. Trauma can affect the nervous system. Trauma affects the very development of the brain. It affects the immune system, and so on. So very physiological pathways that, from the scientific point of view, have been delineated and studied and demonstrated and published. Then trauma also creates behavior patterns that are in themselves harmful. So I can mention two. Trauma can make somebody suppress their emotions in order to be acceptable to others. And once you suppress your emotions, because you can't separate the mind from the body, in fact, it's one unit, and because the emotional system in the brain and the body is part and parcel of the same apparatus that runs the immune system, the hormones, and the nervous system, when people are traumatized or have chronic stress, that actually affects their immune system. It affects their nervous system, their cardiovascular system. One of the compensations for people who get traumatized is to suppress their emotions because that's how they survive their childhoods. But that chronic suppression of emotions, particularly of healthy anger, actually disorganizes the immune system. So people that don't know how to say no, who don't know how to assert their boundaries, who take on way too much, they're going to make themselves sick. Another way that trauma can show up in dysfunction and affliction is that trauma incurs a lot of pain that people are carrying in their bodies and in their nervous systems. People try to escape from their pain. How? Through addictive behaviors, through drugs that soothe the pain, like cocaine and alcohol and heroin and other opiates, or through behaviors like pornography or overeating or shopping or internet or gaming or cell phones or self-cutting, bulimia and so on. And so that these are all trauma-induced behaviors that then themselves will cause more problems later on. So both on the physiological and on the psychological level, trauma leaves consequences that are further undermining of health in the long term.
So, are you saying that trauma or the prevalence of trauma is a modern phenomenon?
No, it's not strictly modern. I mean, we've had it since civilization, really, ever since many, many thousands of years. You can read about it in ancient Greek plays, the incest and the, the internecine violence and so on. You can read about it in the Hindu classics, So trauma's been around for a long time. What is interesting is that what has increased is the stress that people live with. There's been a loss of communality and more isolation, more loneliness. And there's been a real addiction in this culture to purely external achievements, acquisitions, and attainments, ignoring the needs of the real self. That has been exacerbated. It's not new, but it's been exacerbated under modern culture.
You've just used a term there, Gabor, which is the real self.
Yeah.
What is the real self? What do you mean by that?
Well, that's a rather nebulous concept, I admit, and it's been the subject of a lot of discourse in spiritual circles forever. But on a fundamental level, it means being connected to your body and to your emotions. And infants are born with that.
Yeah.
And in the infant, there's no sense of separation between myself and the world. And that separation is induced by life experience and how we bring up kids. But experientially, let me ask you a question. Have you had the experience of being engaged in a conversation or in a group or an activity, and afterwards you said, "Oh, I wasn't being myself"?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah.
You've had that experience?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, what in you knows that you weren't being yourself?
I think when my mind is blank and I can't think of anything to say, and then when I go home, I think, oh, I wish I'd said this, or wish I said that. So kind of mind blank, bit of nervousness. Like
Okay, but what in you tells you that you weren't being yourself? Who in you knows that you weren't being yourself?
Okay, that's the self.
That's the real self. So it's there.
Yeah.
On the other hand, have you had the experience of, oh, yeah, no, I was being true to myself this time? Have you had that experience?
Yes, yeah, of course.
What does that feel like in the body?
Amazing. It feels like freedom, a lot of energy.
Freedom, energy, spaciousness. Well, there it is, so it's not such an abstract question.
No. And it's available to everyone. It's not such a... The way that you've put it is that this kind of feeling of the authentic self isn't something I might have to meditate for 7 years to get. It's actually available at birth.
Well, it is available, but the problem is it gets papered and layered and covered over and hidden by so many dynamics because of the need to fit in or the need to comply or fear or shame and so on. But it is certainly available. And now, then there's other meanings that are more spiritual, I suppose, the Hindu concept of the Atman, and the Brahman and so on. And, which, I understand. I can't say that I've had the experience of that spiritual realization of the real self. I believe it, but I can't say that I can embody it or be consciously experience it. But I know what they're talking about, and what in me knows what they're talking about. Well, that's exactly that sense of self. So, nebulous as it may be, we can approach it for sure.
Of course, you've had many people that you've treated, and not just you. There's a kind of a group of well-known people now working in the field of trauma, dealing with thousands of clients. And I have noticed that in the world of trauma, this idea of a true self, a real self, or an authentic self is very present. For example, I mean, you talk about it as well, but we've seen it in Dr. Richard Schwartz. his work, he talks also about a real self.
Well, Richard talks about the capital S self,
Yeah,
which, by the way, is an ancient Hindu concept. You can find it in the Upanishads.
yeah.
So Richard uses it. He didn't exactly invent it.
He didn't invent it. No, but, I mean, I guess he's arguing it's always there. But he says that in his clients who he works with,
Yeah,
in the world of trauma,
yeah,
his true self always appears to have the same qualities,
yes,
like compassion,
yeah.
courage, and some others.
Presence,
Presence.
yeah, clarity,
Mm,
courage. Um, yeah, and these are the universal traits that everybody who works in the spiritual field will recognize.
yeah.
And you know, and Richard's whole work is about what he calls self-leadership.
Right.
So that the self should be in charge, not our wounded parts. And but interestingly enough, the Hindu spiritual teacher Yogananda also talked about self-leadership,
Right.
and in fact, he even founded a self-leadership institute.
Okay.
Yeah,
Amazing.
yeah,
Well, I guess uh, Dr. Schwartz, he might talk about it as there's a self and then there's lots of fragmentation, different parts, and the self is in charge. Uh, I noticed maybe you don't use that language of parts or
mm,
kind of a fragmented self so much.
yeah.
And I hear you talk more about attachment versus authenticity. Could you kind of share with us your model of this?
I will, but let me comment on Richard's.
Yeah.
Um, we see things very similarly,
Hmm.
and I do talk about fragmentation,
Okay, so.
but because fragmentation happens.
Mm,
If I can tell you I can tell you an amazing example of it. I just don't believe, like he seems to, that we're born with all these different parts.
right. Okay.
I think these parts are not actual existing personalities, but they are mind states that we get into, that we develop in response to trauma.
Mhm.
Sometimes I use the language of parts, like a part of me wants to do this, but I don't make them separate entities as such. Therapeutically, it's sometimes useful to talk about it.
Mm,
So him and I are not that far apart, but in the sense of, are we born with these parts, or are we forever going to be stuck with these parts? No, I think these are not so much different entities as mind states
okay.
and processes, which is sometimes useful to recognize as parts. Now, in terms of authenticity and attachment, him and I are describing the same phenomena, actually, and very closely. Um, we just use somewhat different language.
Mm,
So, uh, children are born with, and this forms a chapter in this book. Children are born with some needs.
mm,
The one need, and the essential need, is for attachment. And attachment means we have to be close to somebody
mm,
in order to be taken care of. So attachment is an actual biological drive, instinctively programmed, not just into our brains, but all mammals have an attachment instinct.
mm,
And the attachment means the pursuit of closeness and proximity for the sake of being taken care of, or for the sake of taking care of the other. So both parents and the infant are wired for attachment. In the case of the parent, as the caring, nurturing individual. In the case of the infant, as the one who receives the care. So that's just an instinct. It's a drive. It's essential. Without that, no mammalian infant would survive.
mm,
Even birds
mhm,
need that attachment instinct in the early months of the young life.
mhm,
Now, and of course, the attachment instinct stays with us all our lives. We form attachments, we form friendships, we form spousal relationships, community relationships. These are all attachment dynamics, but it's never as dependent and as necessary and indispensable as it is in childhood, obviously. So we have that need.
mm,
Now, we also have the other need that you and I have already touched upon, which is to be our true selves. So what does that mean? To be connected to our gut feelings in our bodies and our emotions. That's in need. So let me illustrate that. Let me ask you a question. I often ask audiences this. Have you ever had, Imad, the experience of having a strong gut feeling about something and you ignored it and you regretted it afterwards?
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, now, Why is that? Gut feelings are essential for survival. Out in nature, how long does any creature survive if they're not connected to their gut feelings? They don't. So we evolved connected to ourselves. In fact, that's the only way we could have evolved. So something must have happened that's very powerful that would have made you distrust and disobey your gut feelings. What was that? I can tell you what it was. And I don't know anything about you. I don't know anything about your personal history. But in principle, in general, I can tell you exactly what happened. Stuff happened to you as a child. You had strong gut feelings to fight back or to escape. But to have done that would have meant to go against the attachment need. So you had to give up one or the other. Now, what do you think we give up? We give up the attachment, or we give up the authenticity, the connection to ourselves? What do we give up?
We give up the authenticity.
We give up the authenticity because that's how we survive. So that surrender of authenticity is how many of us survive our childhoods. And then we're afraid to be ourselves because to ourselves, we imagine is to threaten our relationships. So we keep choosing attachment, the acceptance, approval of others, as opposed to being our authentic selves. And it's a real struggle then to regain that self. Now, Richard and the parts work would say, so then I became this nice person and I try and please everybody. Richard would say that's a helper part.
Right.
That part is helping you to stay attached. We're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
We're saying that it's both a response to developmental trauma, and they end up both hurting us. Because ultimately, the suppression of authenticity, as I already mentioned, leads to disease. And Richard would agree with that. And so our work is very similar. Our formulation and our theoretical framework might be a bit different, but we're both saying that the abandonment of the genuine self is actually a survival mechanism.
So could we take that a bit further?
Yeah.
And say that illness is or chronic illness perhaps, is a chronic lack of attachment to the self.
It's a chronic lack of authenticity.
Chronic lack of authenticity.
It's a chronic lack of suppression of yourself for the sake of being acceptable. Now, I don't want to be dogmatic about it. Of course, there's other dynamics or sources of illness, such as pollutants and bad food and, all kinds of stuff. But when I look at people who are chronically ill, it's almost universal. That there are 4 traits that I've noticed, and not only have I noticed it, this has been studied and written up in the literature.
Right.
Except that when I went to medical school, nobody told me about it. It was only after I started seeing it that I realized there was actually scientific literature backing it.
Yeah.
But people tend to be automatically, compulsively concerned with others' needs ahead of their own. They tend to be identified with duty, role, and responsibility out in the world rather than the needs of the self. They tend to repress their healthy anger for fear of displeasing others. And they tend to have this belief that they're responsible for how other people feel and I must never disappoint anybody. Now, these are the traits that I've noticed in people who are chronically ill. It all goes back to a trauma-imposed surrender of authenticity for the sake of being accepted, for the sake of the attachment relationship, which then becomes a chronic habit, which, of course, if I repress my healthy anger, I'm repressing my immune system. If I'm always trying to please you, then I'll never say no to whatever you demand of me, and I'll be stressing myself. Of course, that's going to lead to illness. If I'm more concerned with other people's needs and I ignore my own, then what happens to me? I get sick. So this loss of authenticity, which begins as a survival mechanism, then becomes a source of pathology later on.
Can I just explore that a bit more? Because some of these traits in many spiritual traditions or religious traditions,
They're good things.
They might appear to be virtues. I'm being generous to you. I'm repressing my anger. How would you...
Oh, wait a minute. there's a difference between. I understand your question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to be kind.
Yeah.
It's good to be generous. As a matter of fact, it's human nature. I
Mm.
mean,
Mm.
if you look at Aboriginal cultures,
Mm.
they're very giving.
Yeah.
They're very generous.
Yeah.
They're very
Yeah.
hospitable. They're very welcoming.
Mhm.
You know, and giving is valued much more than receiving. However, I'm not talking about that we shouldn't be kind or generous. I'm saying not at the chronic cost of suppressing ourselves.
Mm.
I can be kind to myself and be very kind to you.
Right. Yeah.
I can be aware of your needs and, when necessary, move to meet your needs without sacrificing my needs in a chronic sense.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. As far as anger is concerned, no spiritual tradition that I know teaches you to repress anger.
Mm.
They tell you to
Manage it. Yeah.
be with it. So the Buddha doesn't say don't be angry.
Okay.
The Buddha says when the monk is angry, the monk knows that he's angry.
Yeah.
So he doesn't say act out your anger on somebody else.
Yeah.
He does say be aware that you're angry. He doesn't say suppress it or repress it. He just say be aware. Now when you're aware, then you can decide what to do with it.
Yeah.
Now sometimes you might have to act out the anger. If you're coming in with a knife, I better be either very afraid and run away, or better be very angry and protect my boundaries.
Yeah.
One or the other. So I don't know of any spiritual tradition that actually teaches repression of anger. They do teach the adept handling of anger rather than the acting it out. That's a very different proposition.
Yeah. I guess the way I've begun to look at it is, am I doing this thing from a place of kind of wholeness?
Yeah.
Or am I doing it because I'm scared that if I don't do this thing on some unconscious level, I'm going to be rejected from the group?
Well,
Something like that.
that's the exact question.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah.
I would like to come back to the topic of illness a bit more.
Yeah.
Or the theme of this whole series is illness and spirituality.
Yeah.
And maybe actually before we go a bit further, is if I could ask you what do you understand by the term spirituality, or how would you define it?
Yeah. Again, it's one of those words like God, like, what do we mean by it? Because when I say God, you might have a totally different concept in your head than what I mean. I'm not a spiritual adept. I haven't followed any spiritual tradition with any kind of discipline, so I can only give you my layperson's sense of spirituality. But it's certainly, now if you look at the indigenous medicinal practices of North America, they have this concept called the medicine wheel.
Medicine wheel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's round. It's got 4 quadrants. It's like 4 pieces of a pie. There's the physical, there's the mental, which means your thoughts and your emotions. There's the social, which means your relationship to other human beings. And there's the spiritual, which is your connection to the whole of existence. So spirituality for me is the awareness and the seeking of connections with all of reality that goes beyond the egoic self and its little concerns. It's not the ignoring of the egoic self, but recognizing that that's not all there is to it. That we're part and parcel of something much greater, ultimately, which is mysterious. Think about it. If you look at science, at some point, there was nothing, no thing. And all of a sudden, something happened. And all of a sudden, the universe appeared. And then, I don't know how many billions later, some particles took on life. And how many billions later, that life then manifests in all these different forms that we have today. What a mystery that is.
Yeah.
But once we realize that we're still particles of that big thing that happened, whatever, a long time ago, how can we think that we're individuals separate? How can we think that our lives and our existence and our activities are isolated for the greater whole? For spirituality, for me, is the awareness and the seeking of unity with that greater whole.
Yeah.
Now, I can talk about it much more articulately than I can actually experience it. but something in me still knows that it's true.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the spiritual traditions are really concerned with that interconnectedness
That's right.
or the connectedness. Some might talk about the connection between self-God,
Yeah,
self-other,
yeah,
self-community, and so on. But what is that relationship, and what are the coordinates of that relationship?
yeah.
Coming to illness then. Sorry, did
Well, I
you?
was just going to say that
Yeah.
going back to the North American indigenous tradition, we're not healthy unless we're balanced in all those quadrants.
Yeah.
So spirituality is definitely a part of what they consider health. And they actually, if you look at the word health, it actually comes from a word for wholeness.
Wholeness, yeah.
And definitely, I think human beings are, in that sense, spiritual by nature, whether they know it or not.
Whether they know it or not, always seeking wholeness
Yeah.
and that connection. Is there a link between spirituality and illness? Or maybe what is the link?
That's a difficult one for me because my emphasis in study and work has been on a relationship of emotions
Yeah.
to illness.
Okay.
No, but in terms of, if you want to define true health, not just as the absence of disease, but actual wholeness, how can we be whole and fully healthy, which is to say, fully functional, fully present, fully living up to our potential, if we're not connected also to our spirituality? That connection can take the form of formal practice. For some people, it's connection with nature.
Yeah.
For some people, it's really genuine connection with other creatures. They may not think of it as spiritual, but it does speak to that need for connection and belonging and being part of something much greater. I don't think we can be said to be fully healthy. Even the absence of disease, we can't said to be fully healthy without that aspect of us being realized.
Great point. And there is a chapter in your book actually about, which really spoke to me, about illness showing up as a teacher.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. So if what I've been saying in this conversation is accurate, which I fully stand behind is accurate, then when illness comes along, we can look at it one of two ways. One is some misfortune to get rid of, and because I don't recommend anybody to get sick, but we also can take it as a wake-up call that something's been out of balance in our lives. Maybe I've been too stressed. Maybe I haven't said no when I should have said no. Maybe I've been suppressing myself. And I know so many people who have learned from their disease. And I call it, may I have the book for a moment?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So let me just actually find this.
I think it's...
I call it a dreadful gift.
The dreadful gift, yeah.
Disease's teacher. Let me quote for you the American singer and musician Sheryl Crow, who had the breast cancer. And what she says here, I've heard it and seen it so often. So she says, surviving breast cancer has redefined who I am and how I am. Until then, I spent a lifetime. Maybe your eyes are better than mine.
Yeah,
can you read this paragraph?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Right at the top of the page. Without my glasses, it's too small for me.
Surviving breast cancer redefined who and how I am. Until then, I'd spent a lifetime being a caretaker for everyone around me. From there, I started to put myself first. I had voices at the back of my head telling me whatever I did wasn't good enough. Now, finally, I've silenced them.
Yeah, well, there's what happened. The disease was your teacher. I don't recommend that you get cancer to learn that lesson, but I've seen a lot of people, even with terminal illness, who say, this disease is the best gift I ever got because it made me connected to myself, made me realize what's really important in life, even though it shortened my life. Now, again, I don't recommend it, but I'm saying is that when disease shows up, it can act as a teacher, and if you listen well enough, then actually a lot of people can actually find healing if they start listening to the message that the disease is delivering for them. And I've seen lots of examples of that.
And when you say healing, do you mean physical healing from their symptoms, or?
I've seen that.
Yeah.
I've seen people with severe conditions who've been told it's hopeless, you're going to be sick for the rest of your life, who are totally disease-free because they actually start to be authentic. I've also seen people die. Like I give one example here in this book, a person with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis called motor neuron disease here in Britain. It's a degenerative disease of the nervous system. And this man came to a retreat I was leading, and he had a certain kind of ALS or motor neuron disease that didn't make his body paralyzed, but it affected his vocal cords and his breathing muscles. And he could barely talk. And he came to the retreat and he said, I am here because I want to live longer. So we did this retreat. And at the end of the retreat, he said, when I said I wanted to live longer, actually his voice was much stronger at the end of the retreat. And he said, when I came in, I said I want to live longer. I thought I wanted to live for a longer period of time. No, he said, no, sorry. What he actually said, I came here because I want to live. And he said at the end, when I said that, I meant that I want to live longer. But now I understand that as long as I'm alive, I want to be fully myself and fully alive in myself.
Wow.
So he had a wonderful last year and a half of life, reconnected with his family. They all celebrated every day together, and he had this beautiful death. He didn't live longer, but he lived. So healing can just mean that as well, of becoming whole for whatever time remains to you, because that's what healing means, is wholeness.
If you don't mind, I'd be interested to segue a little bit into addiction, as you mentioned it earlier.
Yeah.
And of course, you've written on addiction, and the name of your book is In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts.
In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which is a Buddhist phrase. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, close encounters with addiction.
Could you explain that Buddhist phrase?
Well, first of all, it's a Buddhist phrase.
Okay, yeah.
So I think in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, people cycle through 6 realms. The realm of the gods,
Yeah.
the human realm, which is our ordinary self, the animal realm, which is our instincts and our drives and so on, that's the animal realm, the hell realm, which is our rage and our hatred and our despair and so on, the realm of the gods, which is benign spiritual state, the realm of the jealous titans,
Right. Yeah.
you know, and the realm of the hungry ghosts. And the creatures in the realm of hungry ghosts are depicted with small narrow gullets, small mouths, huge empty bellies, and they're forever trying to satiate their hunger, but they can never do it. So that's the realm of the hungry ghosts. And now my contention is that as human beings, we cycle through all the 6 realms.
Yeah.
But people who are addicted tend to be in the hungry ghost realm all the time, always trying to get more of something, more and more, so that they finally feel satiated. That's the drug addict, that's the sex addict, that's the shopping addict, the eating addict, whatever you want. And my contention is that people are in the hungry ghost realm to escape the hell realm of pain and rage and despair, so that the addiction serves as a way to soothe their pain. So my mantra under addiction is, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. And that pain goes back to trauma.
So could we say that addiction is a lack of connection to one's own wholeness or true self?
Absolutely. That's one of its sources. Well, let me give you this definition of mine on addiction and then just ask you a question about it, okay? So I define addiction as manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in and therefore craves, but then suffers negative consequences and cannot or does not give up despite the harm. I said any behavior. Could be drugs, nicotine, caffeine, cocaine, crystal meth, alcohol, heroin. Could be, as I said earlier, sex, pornography, internet, cell phones, work, gaming, eating, shopping, bulimia, whatever. The issue is not the behavior, but your relationship to it. Craving, pleasure, relief in the short term, harm in the long term, and your inability to divest from it. That's what an addiction is. So, Imad, I'm going to ask you, without asking for any details, according to that definition, have you ever had an addictive pattern in your life? Ever?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not going to ask you what or when or how long. I'm just going to ask you, what did it do for you in the short term that you liked?
I think it gave me escapism.
Well, who needs to escape?
Somebody in pain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What else?
A sense of connection.
Who needs connection?
Somebody disconnected.
Somebody who's isolated.
Yeah.
And disconnected.
It gave me a sense of just to forget, I think, actually, a lot of it, of what was going on around me.
All right. Well, who needs to forget?
Somebody again in pain.
Somebody in pain again.
Yeah.
That's why my mantra: don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. In other words, the addiction wasn't a disease that you had. It wasn't some choice that you made. It was your attempt to find inner peace and pain relief and a sense of connection. Now, inner peace, sense of connection, that's your real self.
Yeah.
And you were disconnected from it. So ultimately, the addictions are desperate, doomed attempts to find the self, at least the state that the self would give you if you were in touch with it.
Could we go as far as to say then being connected to the self? And to me, that was what would define to be spiritually connected,
Yeah.
a sense of inner peace. Would that then preclude addiction?
Yes.
That's a very strong statement.
Why would you need to, why would you need to escape from a state of connection? Why would you have to look for connection if you're connected?
Yeah.
So yeah, no, self-connection it does preclude addiction. No, that doesn't mean you wouldn't enjoy certain things in life, but you wouldn't be compelled to pursue them at the risk of harming yourself.
I'm very interested to talk to you about pathways to this healing.
Yeah.
And maybe what I'll say is, as somebody who's been very interested in religion my whole life and spirituality, spiritual paths, and joined lots of different spiritual paths, and I'm studying for a PhD in religious studies. I'm really fascinated by people like yourself, especially yourself, involved in the work of trauma, because I see great parallels between that recovery of self and the spiritual journey as outlined in so many of the classics. Most spiritual journeys will talk about, like in the Islamic realm, they talk about a recovery of fitra, which means your true self. And many poems in the Islamic world that I've studied are about going on a long journey and finding out what you're looking for all along was yourself.
When you mentioned your pursuit of your PhD, I thought of the Sufi poet Hafiz. And Hafiz got a poem about throw away all the books. He said, you don't need all these books, you just need yourself. And but that aside, the search of the true self and the sense that is there, that's central to, I think, all spiritual traditions. Although some of them will deny, I think, that there's a true self or anything, but I don't get that one particularly. I think maybe they're talking about there's no fixed self.
But they still might talk about a nature. Like in Buddhism, we wouldn't talk about a fixed self. That's definitely not a Buddhist concept.
No.
But there still is this potential for kind of wisdom, knowledge, greatness, and
and
a Buddha nature.
And presence.
Yeah.
And connection, which is what other traditions would define as the real self.
Yeah, for sure. I'm really interested in kind of the journeys of people who you've worked with. What do some of them look like in terms of healing and what it's done for them, maybe in their reconnection to self, discovery of self, what I would call a spiritual journey.
What's really interesting is when you look at people who are addicted.
Yeah.
Now, I used to work in what is the Western world's most concentrated and desperate area of drug use, which is the downtown east side of Vancouver, British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
People there are hooked on all these substances and they're very ill physically very often. They have HIV, hepatitis C, they die young of all manner of conditions, overdoses, suicides, violence, illnesses of brain and body. But something so many of my patients would say to me is, Doc, if I ever beat this, if I ever get over this, I'm going to spend the rest of my life helping other people not to get the state that I was in. In other words, the desire to connect and to help and to give was the other side of their addiction. So that even in the midst of the throes of their addiction, they were at least fantasizing or longing for this state of connection and giving and generosity and spiritual awareness. I've certainly seen a lot of people who've recovered from addiction become real, I don't want to call them saints, but in certain aspects very saintly, giving, generous, concern for others, compassion, and so on.
And in your view, is this kind of self, is it always, can it be damaged, or is it?
No.
It's always there.
It cannot be damaged. It's always there. Look at the word recovery.
Yeah.
What does it mean to recover something?
Yeah.
What does it mean to recover something?
To regain.
To find it again.
To find it again, yeah.
No. If you can find it, it means it was never destroyed. Otherwise, you couldn't find it. And you yourself mentioned the Islamic concept of recovery, finding the true self. No, that true self can never be damaged. It can be covered. You may lose sight of it permanently if you don't seek to recover it. You may go to your death out of contact with it, but it's never gone. It can't be destroyed.
I'll tell you one thing that this kind of work has done for me personally.
Yeah.
In my own way, as I look at faith and spirituality, is I came from a background, like perhaps many other people, where we were taught our group has the exclusive access to true spirituality.
You have the copyright on the truth.
That's right, yeah. And as I started going through my own healing journey, and that's from physical illness, I started looking down the routes that you talk about. I started to feel a new kind of connection to myself, a new kind of spirituality, I'd say, which was so grounded and firm. It's something I've never felt before. And what I'd notice is other people that I'd be meeting from all sorts of different backgrounds and groups, they're experiencing the same thing as me. I think I'm experiencing something spiritual, so too are they. And it's made me think much more of a universal human experience. Now, in theology or anthropology of religion, sometimes we say we can't universalize experiences. So perhaps I'm being a bit universalizing, but that is what I've felt and experienced.
Well, it's been called a perennial philosophy, which is shared along all kinds of traditions. Look, is water composed of 2 molecules of hydrogen and 1 molecule of oxygen? Is that only true in Britain? Is it also true in Hungary?
That's true everywhere, as far as I know. Yeah.
It's the same thing. Why would truth be confined to one particular tradition? And what happens to this is where religion comes into it. Is that religions tend to be they have a tendency to become very tribal, very possessive, very exclusive, very intolerant, very arrogant, actually. And this is true for all religions, and I don't care whether it's Islam or Judaism or Christianity. once they become institutionalized, the ego starts to take over. And it's the ego's need to be right and make other people wrong. And religions can certainly take on those egoic features. But that's got nothing to do with the spiritual essence. And what's really interesting is if you look at the original avatars or inspirations for any spiritual tradition, there's that universality there.
Yeah.
And then the particularity becomes then petrified later on. And I've seen this. I mean, I'm certainly not the first one to notice this, but it's a characteristic of a lot of religions. And that's where people need to sort of find the actual spiritual truth inside the religion. It's there, but sometimes you have to really wade through a lot of weeds before you get to the truth of it. And that's also why some people become disillusioned with religion. And unfortunately, since they equate spirituality with religion, they also give up on spirituality.
Right.
So religions have done a lot of harm in that way to spirituality.
Well, on that note then,
Yeah.
A lot of people have experienced something that they would call religious trauma.
Yeah.
So maybe my first question on this kind of topic of religious trauma, is religious trauma different in quality to any other kind of trauma?
But what do you mean by religious trauma?
So is this kind of trauma, what I'm trying to get at, is it different from other kinds of childhood trauma? Is the shame same or different in quality?
I'm not sure what to say to that, except that shame is a fundamental sense that there's something elementally wrong with you and you're not deserving. And that is universal to shame of all kinds.
Yeah.
So I don't want to differentiate too much.
Yeah. I guess the reason I asked that question is in my own upbringing and thinking, I always had this low level feeling of guilt and shame.
Yeah.
And what I thought that was I thought everybody who was religious or Muslim like me felt this.
Yeah.
And I assumed that. And what I used to think was, as a child, when I die, I'm definitely going to hell. So I had that kind of a lot of my life. I don't really experience it anymore. And now as I've thought about my own illness and had some kind of healing from my own illness, I realized that it didn't actually come from religion.
No.
It came from my own attachments and feelings of shame, which I picked up all by myself or from the environment around me. But I don't view it as specific to religion anymore in the way that I used to.
No, I agree with you. I don't think it's specific to religion. I think religions can reinforce it, but that shame and that guilt begins long before you begin to understand religion.
Yeah.
So it's in you. Now, some religions will then emphasize it and build on it and use it as a way to bring you under control, but it was in you before that.
Yeah, I would say that was my experience.
Yeah, I think that's pretty universal.
Yeah. For people who might have some kind of religious trauma, let me define it through another example.
Yeah.
I know people who, for example, when they were young, they were forced to meditate.
Yeah.
And when they became older, they became very averse to that meditation because they felt coerced when they were young.
Absolutely.
What pathways do people with this kind of religious trauma have for healing when a lot of tools available to them from the spiritual world or the religious world are actually triggering for them?
Exactly. And you know, there's other religious trauma where you belong to a group and you believe in the group and you think the group's got the truth, and then you find out that it's very flawed and you know, and then when you try and leave, then you get ostracized, and you know, so religious trauma comes in many forms. And then people throw out the baby with the bathwater. You know, they because of the revulsion of what happened to them, then they give up what actually might have been positive in itself.
That's right, yeah.
You know, I'd say don't do to yourself what was done to you. Don't coerce yourself.
Right, okay.
So first of all, take your freedom, take your distance, and see where that leaves you,
Mm-hmm.
and see if anything calls you.
Yeah.
And if you have that kind of religious trauma in you, get some psychological help.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems to me, if I understand your case from what little I've learned about it, you had a certain wake-up message from your body, which made you aware of things that you were ignorant of within yourself before. But that has also led you, or at least supported you, in gaining a more generous and deeper sense of spirituality.
Yeah, without a doubt. Actually, if you don't mind, I'd love to share it with you.
Yeah.
My own journey is around just over 3 years ago.
Yeah.
I thought I was in a really amazing position. I just gained my scholarship to begin this PhD.
Okay.
I was about to start in a few months. I felt great in life.
Yeah.
Although I did have that constant feeling that I mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
that I don't know how I'll face God. Not that I was even doing anything wrong. It was just a
Yeah.
constant feeling that
Yeah.
I had.
Yeah.
And I think I compensated for it actually most of my life by engaging myself in spiritual searching and joining
Yeah.
different religious groups and so on.
Yeah.
And perhaps I said to myself, I've got this bad feeling about myself, but I do all this religious activity, so hopefully I'll be okay. So there was a compensation.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when I caught COVID, I was hospitalized
No.
and I was bedbound for around 9 months.
Hmm.
And I used a wheelchair for around 2 years.
Gosh.
And I'm actually very new to walking still.
Hmm.
And in those moments when I was lying in bed, the doing, all the things I used to do to kind of distract from that feeling, I couldn't, and I just had to be.
Yeah.
And that was terrible, every single day facing that. And actually, there's a video of yours I'd seen where you talked about illness as a teacher.
Yeah.
And you said, for many people, I think you said, all aspects of your life are created by you.
Yeah.
Even your illness, by some part of you that loves you more than you love yourself.
I was quoting the spiritual teacher A.H. Alma's,
Right.
Hamid Ali, who said that these terrible, difficult things that happen to you are actually given to you by a part of yourself that wants you to wake up and get you to go in the right direction.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I didn't quite understand it, but I just knew that, this is right.
Yeah.
I don't get it, but I know that it appeals to me. And I was meditating a lot because it seemed to dampen my symptoms. It didn't take them away, but it dampened them. And so one day I was meditating, trying to dampen my symptoms, and I suddenly felt symptoms increase all across my body. And that was unusual because I used to associate symptoms with overexertion physically. I'd try to walk too much or try to stand up too quickly.
Yeah.
And accompanying that was rage.
Yeah.
But I didn't know why I was angry.
Course.
And I was interested in how they could work together.
Of course.
And I do think some of these somatic approaches use that same language of bringing together things like neuroscience, knowledge about the nervous system, but whilst also integrating, for those open to it or interested in it, spiritual approaches as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's totally true. At the same time, I mean, I studied the neuroscientific research. And it's important, it's interesting, and it certainly helps me articulate what I've learned in a way that people can relate to. But at the same time, what is it telling us? It's telling us that body and mind are inseparable. It's telling us that what really matters is love and connection.
That's right, yeah.
What is it telling us that we shouldn't already know? I mean, it pictures it and it delineates it and it articulates it. But I'm going to a big trauma conference tomorrow in Oxford. I was speaking there. A lot of other names that you'd recognize. Dick Schwartz is going to be there. Bessel van der Kolk, Dan Siegel, a whole lot of other, and sometimes I shake my head and I think, there's all of us trauma gurus
Yeah.
getting all this attention and appreciation for saying what? What are we actually saying? We're saying that if you treat human beings well, and if you love them, they're going to be okay, and if you don't, they won't be okay. This is what I get the big bucks for, you know? So really, it's all so simple.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get too caught up in our heads and trying to prove the obvious, you know? So I just urge people not to try and move towards the healing path through their intellect so much. Not to forget or to ignore the intellect, but don't rely on it. Get in touch with the heart, get in touch with the body. There's a lot of truth there. Your gut feelings. And if I just may say finally, that from a scientific, physiological point of view, this is one brain that we have over here, but it's not the only brain we have. There's also a brain function in the heart. There's a nerve, it's called neurocardiology. There's a nervous system in the heart that actually speaks the truth. Not to mention the brain in the gut. And those three need to be connected and coordinated. And when they are, we have our wholeness. In the Western world, this has taken over. And for all its brilliance, its achievements, contributions, and value, when we're disconnected from these others, we're just, as somebody said, we're genius level reptiles.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gabor. It's been a fascinating conversation about the nature of illness and its relationship to trauma and spirituality. I hope maybe in the future when you visit the UK again, you can visit us in person in Cambridge. I'm sure the students and professors would love to meet you. And just again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me and for the conversation. I will be back a year from now.
Okay.
Towards the end of next September, and perhaps we'll be in touch about that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Doctor.